How do you analyze a negligence per se issue on a torts essay question? Remember, we said your negligence analysis is centered on 4 elements: duty, breach, causation, and damages. And thus far in our video series, we've been primarily focusing on the first element, which is duty. And remember, we said duty is really a 2-part analysis. Number 1, did the defendant owe the plaintiff a duty of care? And number 2, if so, what level of care did the defendant actually owe the plaintiff? Remember, we called this the standard of care. And we said your default standard of care is the reasonable person standard of care. What would a reasonably prudent person do under like circumstances as measured by an objective test? Right, but we said even though that's your default standard of care, there are situations where the standard can be raised or lowered. So it's better to think about the standard of care as a spectrum that can change. And we said one way it could change was when certain classes of defendants were involved. Remember, we said if the defendant is a physician, we might raise the standard of care. And if the defendant is a child engaged in a non-adult activity, we might lower the standard of care. And in our last video, we really discussed landowners and possessors of land. What happens to the standard of care in that situation? In this video, though, we want to discuss a different way that the standard of care can be changed from this default reasonable person standard of care, and that is negligence per se. What's typically happening in negligence per se is you're going to have a statute that is defining a standard of care somewhere on this spectrum as a matter of law. Okay, and if the 5 elements we're going to discuss in a minute are satisfied under negligence per se, in a majority of jurisdictions, the defendant is going to be held liable for negligence as a matter of law. It's conclusive if these 5 elements are satisfied. In a minority of jurisdictions, it's going to create a rebuttable presumption. But what are these 5 elements? Let's just break these down really quick under negligence per se. Number 1, you're going to need a statute that imposes a duty of care on the defendant. Number 2, you're going to need to determine whether the defendant violated that statute by failing to perform the duty of care imposed by that statute. Number 3, you're going to have to determine whether the plaintiff was in the class of people that the statute was designed to protect. Number 4, you're going to have to determine whether the plaintiff sustained the type of harm that the statute was designed to protect against. And number 5, you're going to have to show causation, whether the violation of the statute was the actual and proximate cause of the plaintiff's harm. If you can establish all 5 of these elements, remember, in a majority of jurisdictions, that means the defendant is liable for negligence as a matter of law. In a minority of jurisdictions, it creates a rebuttable presumption. Okay, so let's just break these elements down briefly and then go over some examples. So remember again, the good news about negligence per se on a torts essay question is it's an issue that is very easy to identify. The fact pattern will have to give you a statute that imposes a duty of care. That's your first element. So generally, it's going to be at the bottom of the fact pattern, above the call of the question. You're going to see a statute listed. And if you have that, you basically know almost with 100% certainty on a tort essay question that you're going to be dealing with negligence per se. So number 1, you have to find that statute in the fact pattern that's imposing a duty of care. It needs to be a criminal or regulatory statute that imposes a duty of care. Number 2, you have to see if the defendant violated that statute by failing to perform that duty of care imposed. That's usually also going to be pretty easy to identify. Imagine that you have a fact pattern that tells you the speed limit is 70 miles per hour and the defendant's going 75 miles per hour. It's a clear violation of the statute. Clearly, the statute's imposing a duty of care to travel at one speed. You are violating that statute if you are exceeding that speed, right? Very easy usually to identify 1 and 2 in a tort fact pattern. Where it can get a little bit trickier is going to be these last 3 elements, 3, 4, and 5. So what 3 and 4, class and type of harm, are really asking you to do is kind of look at the legislative intent of the statute. Why did the legislator create this statute? What group of people were they trying to protect? And what type of harm were they trying to protect against? Right? You want to determine if the plaintiff is in the class of people that the statute was designed to protect, and you want to determine if the plaintiff sustained the type of harm that this statute was designed to protect against. And then finally, causation, again, can be tricky to show, but you're going to have to show that the violation of the statute was the actual and proximate cause of the plaintiff's harm. Okay, so let's go over a really easy hypothetical first, and then maybe we can do some more nuanced examples and show where this can get a little bit trickier. But for something that's really easy, typically where you're going to see negligence per se in real life is building code violations. That's usually very straightforward. So imagine that you have a statute that imposes a duty of care on landlords to maintain their fire escapes to good repair, right? They have to keep the fire escapes working, no malfunctions. You know, they have to be, every fire escape has to be kept in working order and good repair at all times. Well, let's say that the landowner violates this statute, and for one of his tenants, he has a fire escape that is clearly malfunctioned. He knows about it but has ignored it and chooses not to fix that fire escape. We have a clear violation of the statute, right? The statute is imposing a duty of care to maintain the fire escapes for each tenant. He has violated, the landlord is violating that statute by not maintaining this tenant's fire escape, right? So we have a clear violation of the statute. Now let's say, of course, we have a fire. All the other building tenants are escaping down their fire escapes, but this tenant's fire escape is broken. So he can't climb down. Say he's on the 3rd floor, so he has to jump. And when he jumps, he hits the ground. The impact causes him to break his leg, right? So now he's suing the landlord. The tenant is suing the landlord for the damages resulting from his broken leg. Okay, so statute and violation, we clearly can show that the statute imposed a duty to upkeep the fire escape. Landlord violated that. Is this tenant in the class of people that this statute was designed to protect? Yes, obviously a building code statute is there to protect tenants. We want fire escapes to be working so that tenants can safely escape if there's a fire. So the plaintiff, being a tenant, was clearly in the class that this statute was designed to protect. Did he sustain the type of harm that this statute was designed to protect against? Yes, the entire purpose of this statute is to keep people from jumping out of windows. We want to give them a safe way with a fire escape to reach the ground in the event of a fire. So jumping is the exact type of harm we're trying to prevent with this statute. So the type of harm sustained is going to work. And finally, can we show that the violation of the statute was the actual and proximate cause of the tenant's injury? Yes. If the fire escape had been working, if he could have just climbed down, there would have been no harm. It's but for causation. There's no unforeseeable events that would have broken the chain of liability. A fire in an apartment building is foreseeable. Therefore, all 5 elements are going to be satisfied. So we have negligence per se, which means in a majority of jurisdictions that landlord is going to be negligent as a matter of law. Minority creates that rebuttable presumption. So that's a very easy example of a building code violation that results in harm, and you have clear negligence per se. One of the classic examples of negligence per se that gets a little bit trickier and where you can see some of these elements start to break down a little bit is a situation that is called ignition and left in key cases, right? Or key and ignition cases, right? I mean, I'm sure you read some of these in law school or at another point, maybe you've heard about them. So what you generally have here is 3 parties, and we can just say A, B, and C. So A is a car owner, B, so is the car owner, B is a thief, and C is the plaintiff who is injured by the thief. So C is the injured party. Okay, so what happens in this fact pattern with A, B, and C is you have a statute that says you are not allowed to leave your car running with the keys in the ignition while you are not in the car. So you can't leave a car unattended and running. So we have a statute that is imposing a duty of care to watch your car, attend to your car while it is running. Now let's say a car owner needs to run into a store real quick. Maybe it's a grocery store. He's going in to pick up one item. So he parks his car, leaves it running, and runs into the store. Well, we have a clear violation of the duty imposed by this statute. So 1 and 2 are satisfied. A has left his car running and is not there to watch it. So we have a violation of the statute. Now let's say that a thief, B, comes along and steals the car, and as he's evading the scene with the stolen car, he collides with C. C is injured, and the key here is C wants to sue A. C is suing A for his damages. He's not suing the thief. That would be a completely different analysis. The person who is injured by the thief is suing the car owner under a negligence per se theory. Okay, so C is saying, hey look, A left his car running and unattended, which is a violation of the statute, and now I'm injured. So we have negligence per se, right? Well, we have 1 and 2 satisfied, and 3 is probably also satisfied too. Obviously, when the lawmakers who created this statute were probably designing this statute to protect motorists on the road. Leaving a car unattended to could obviously roll. If you don't have the parking brake properly, initiated or properly operating, the car could reverse or roll or injure some other motorist on the road, right? So clearly I do think that C would be in the class of people that this statute was intended to protect. Where it gets a little bit dicey though is this the type of harm that the statute is designed to protect against? Well, maybe not, maybe so. And courts have grappled with this exact issue, and different courts have come to different conclusions. So if some sort of fact pattern was given to you like this, it would be best to analyze this from both perspectives. Well, defendant would argue this, plaintiff would argue this, but the main idea here is the type of harm that this statute was designed to protect against, a car rolling or not rolling, probably isn't the type of harm that happened here, right? A thief stealing the car, running away from the scene, and colliding with another person. Is that really the type of harm that this statute was intended to protect against? In my opinion, just my thought of it, probably not what the legislators were thinking when they designed that law. Now, what will typically be argued though is that is very foreseeable. So plaintiffs will really focus heavily on this 5th element of causation. But the idea is it is foreseeable. You leave a car running, a thief could easily get into that and drive away, and we know a thief going away from the scene of the crime is probably not going to be the world's most responsible driver. So this is a foreseeable injury. So the causation element is going to be satisfied, and this class element is going to be satisfied. But really where it's dicey is this type of harm issue. So what I would say is, and the most prudent thing to do on a tort essay question would be to analyze this under a unless the call of the question is obviously asking you to do something else. But if the call of the question is just asking you to discuss all relevant legal issues, then you would probably want to do a negligence per se analysis and argue this 4th element both ways. But the catch here is, under a pure negligence analysis, duty, breach, causation, and damages, C can probably hold A liable for ordinary negligence. I mean, do you think it's under the reasonable person standard of care, would a reasonably prudent person of ordinary sensibilities leave their keys running in a car unattended to? Probably not. So you probably have a breach of the duty owed. And then under causation, like we just discussed, all of this was probably foreseeable. There's probably nothing. It's obviously the but-for cause, and there's probably nothing in the chain of causation that would break liability. Leaving your keys in a car, it's foreseeable a thief could steal that car and injure another person in the process. That seems pretty foreseeable. Obviously, we have damages. So a standard ordinary negligence analysis, C could probably hold A liable under that theory. But the idea of negligence per se, where you have to show that this is the type of harm that the statute was designed to protect against, is a little bit harder of an analysis. But that's how all of this is going to break down. Under negligence per se, the main thing you want to look out for, the main thing to remember is this is going to be a situation where you have a statute that is defining a standard of care as a matter of law. And this is, by the way, the last video that we need to go over for duty, I hope. This is the only other way, other than having certain classes of defendants, that's really going to change your standard of care owed from the reasonable person standard of care. Remember, there's only two ways we can change this default standard of care. Number one, a class of defendant that we know changes it is involved, which again, you can watch our last videos to learn all about those and read the descriptions below those videos, and it'll break down all the classes of defendants you need to worry about that can change the standard of care. The other big way is obviously under negligence per se, where a statute is defining a standard of care as a matter of law. Okay, but this covers the second part of this duty analysis, I think, pretty fully. Oh yeah, one final caveat on negligence per se. A violation could be excused in certain situations. This is pretty rare, but say there's an emergency situation where actually complying with the statute would cause a greater risk of harm than not complying. So an emergency situation, or if somebody's incapacitated and unable to comply because they're incapacitated, someone has a heart attack, and passes out while driving a car. Obviously, we could excuse the violation in some situations. Just a small caveat, that's pretty rare you would ever see that on a tort essay, but something to be aware of. The violation could be excused. Okay, but with that, guys, I'll leave you to it, and hopefully in our next video, we can move on past duty and move on to the second element of negligence, which is breach. But until then, guys, I wish you all the absolute best, and I'll see you at our next video.